In exploring this book, I learned more about Leonard, and perhaps not more, but a great deal about Leonard.
One of my greatest regrets is that Leonard and I were not as close as we had been during those last few years of his life. It is heartbreaking. It is something I will wonder about and regret forever. For 50 years, they were the most famous friendship in American science fiction. Two men, two characters, one show that changed the world. Captain James T. Kirk and Mr. Spock, the human heart and the logical mind, standing together on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise for 3 television seasons, 6 feature films, and 5 decades of cultural memory so deep that even people who never watched a single episode know their names. But behind that legendary partnership lies a story that is not triumphant, but devastating. Because in the final years of Leonard Nimoy's life, the last 5 years, the years when a man of 83 was quietly dying, William Shatner did not speak to him. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a word. And Shatner, now 95 years old, has said publicly, in print, in memoir, in interview, that he still does not know why, that the silence came without explanation, that the friendship of 50 years simply stopped, like a door closing in an empty house, and no one ever told him where the key had gone. That is the part nobody talks about when they talk about Kirk and Spock. They were born 3 days apart, in the same year, in 1931. They found each other in Hollywood before anyone knew their names. They built something together that outlasted every studio contract, every sequel, every convention appearance. Something that looked, from the outside, like the rarest thing in the entertainment industry. A genuine and lifelong friendship between two men who needed each other. And then, in the final chapter, it ended. Quietly. Without a goodbye. And one of them died before the silence could ever be broken. If you have ever lost someone before you had the chance to say the thing you needed to say, stay with us, because this is that story. There is a particular kind of grief that does not arrive at the funeral. It does not come with the phone call, or with the headline, or with the moment the world finds out and begins its cycle of tributes and retrospectives and carefully worded statements. That kind of grief, the kind that truly settles, arrives later. It arrives in the quiet moments. In the middle of a sentence you start and cannot finish. In the anniversary you remember alone. In the regret that has no resolution, because the person who could have resolved it is no longer there to ask. William Shatner is 95 years old. He has lived, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of American entertainment. He has played the most iconic captain in the history of science fiction. He has written books, recorded albums, won Emmy Awards, hosted television programs, and in October of 2021, at 90 years of age, became the oldest human being ever to travel to space, riding the Blue Origin capsule built by Jeff Bezos into the edge of the atmosphere and looking back at the Earth with the eyes of the man who had once only pretended to travel among the stars. He has done all of that, and he is still carrying this. In 2022, Shatner published a memoir titled Boldly Go, Reflections on a Life of Awe and Wonder. The title is expansive. The tone is philosophical. The book is the work of a man in his 90s who has earned the right to look back at a life of genuine consequence and speak about it with the authority that only time can grant. And inside that book, between the reflections on space travel and legacy and the nature of wonder, Shatner returned again to Leonard Nimoy, to the friendship, to the silence, to the question he has never been able to answer. He had already written an entire book about Nimoy. In 2016, 1 year after Nimoy's death, Shatner published Leonard, My 50-Year Friendship with a Remarkable Man. The title alone tells you what the friendship meant to him. 50 years. Not a working relationship. Not a professional association. Not two actors who happened to share a set. A friendship. 50 years of one. And yet the final chapter of that friendship was silence. That is where we begin. In the winter of 1931, within the span of 3 days, 2 boys were born on opposite sides of the northeastern corner of North America. And the distance between them, measured in miles and in worlds, could not have suggested that their lives would one day become so completely intertwined that it would be impossible to speak of one without eventually speaking of the other. William Shatner was born on the 22nd of March, 1931, in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He was born into a Jewish family of modest means, the son of Joseph Shatner, a clothing manufacturer whose work was steady but never lavish, and Anne Garmez, a woman whose emotional temperature in the home Shatner would later describe with the careful language of a man who loves his parents and still remembers what it cost him to grow up under their roof. Montreal in the 1930s was not a city of easy comfort for Jewish families navigating the particular social architecture of mid-century Quebec. Shatner learned early, the way children in complicated households always learn early, that performance was a form of survival. That if you were funny enough, loud enough, present enough, you could fill a room and make the room feel safe. He carried that lesson into every audition he ever walked into, and he never put it down. Leonard Simon Nimoy was born 3 days later, on the 26th of March, 1931, in Boston, Massachusetts. His parents were Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, Max Nimoy and Dora Spinner, who had arrived in America carrying the particular combination of hope and exhaustion that defines the immigrant experience at its most honest. They settled in the West End of Boston, in a neighborhood that was dense and working class and alive with the sound of people building new lives out of old languages. Leonard grew up in that neighborhood, in that particular kind of American Jewish household where education was not a luxury but a covenant, and where the idea that a boy might one day stand on a stage and pretend to be someone else was treated, initially, with something between confusion and alarm. He was 11 years old when he saw his first play. He was 11 years old when he decided, with the absolute certainty that only children and geniuses possess, that this was what he would do with his life. His father was not convinced. His father, in fact, was deeply unconvinced. Max Nimoy wanted his son to pursue something real, something with a foundation, something you could point to and name and know would still be there in 20 years. Acting was not that thing. Acting was uncertainty dressed in a costume. Leonard understood his father's position. He did not change his mind. What is remarkable, looking back across the distance of nearly a century, is how much these 2 boys, born 3 days apart, on opposite sides of an international border, in 2 different countries, raised in 2 different cities, shaped by 2 different versions of the same immigrant Jewish experience, were already moving toward the same point on the map. Not because fate is a narrative device that operates with poetic precision, but because both of them, independently, at almost exactly the same age, in almost exactly the same years, decided that the stage was the place where they belonged. And both of them, against the measured skepticism of parents who wanted safety for their sons, walked toward it anyway. They arrived in Hollywood in the 1950s, both of them young, both of them hungry, both of them working the kinds of roles that do not appear in the highlight reels of celebrated careers. Small parts, guest appearances, the kind of work that pays the rent and teaches you your craft and reminds you every single day that the distance between ambition and arrival is measured in years, not weeks. They met during this period, before Star Trek, before Kirk, before Spock, before any of the iconography that would later make their names permanent. They met as two working actors in a city full of working actors, and something in the meeting held. There was a recognition, Shatner would later suggest, that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to deny. Two men from similar backgrounds, navigating similar pressures, carrying similar hungers, who found in each other a kind of company that the industry, for all its manufactured warmth, rarely provides. The friendship that began in those early Hollywood years was not yet the friendship that would be tested by fame. It was quieter than that. It was the friendship of two men who had not yet become who they were going to be, finding each other in the space before the transformation. They could not have known, in those early years, what the next decade would bring. They could not have known that a television producer named Gene Roddenberry was building something that would change both of their lives beyond any reasonable prediction, and that he would put the two of them at the center of it. But before we get to 1966, before we get to the bridge of the Enterprise and the chemistry that nobody expected and the friendship that half a century could not fully contain, there is one question worth sitting with for a moment. What does it mean to find, in the middle of a competitive and often brutal industry, the one person who genuinely sees you? And what do you do when, 50 years later, that person is gone, and you realize you never got to ask them why they stopped? Gene Roddenberry had a problem. It was 1966, and the problem was not the budget, though the budget was never enough. It was not the network, though the network was never fully convinced. It was not the sets, which were built for television money and filmed with television speed, and somehow, against all reasonable expectation, managed to suggest the vastness of a universe that no camera had ever actually seen. The problem was simpler than any of that, and more fundamental. The problem was the center of the show. Star Trek, as Roddenberry conceived it, was built on a philosophical tension. Not on action, not on spectacle, though it had both, but on the friction between two ways of being human. Or more precisely, between being human and being something that had decided to transcend it. Captain James T. Kirk was all instinct and passion and moral urgency, a man who made decisions with his gut and his heart and occasionally his fists, and who was almost always right in ways that logic could not fully explain. Mr. Spock was the counter-argument made flesh, half human, half Vulcan, committed to reason with a devotion so complete it had the quality of religion, and deeply, privately, irrevocably ambivalent about the human half of himself that he could never fully silence. Two characters, one tension, and it would only work. It would only become the thing that Star Trek became. If the two men playing those characters had between them something that could not be manufactured by a casting director or written into a script, it required chemistry. The real kind. The kind that either exists or does not, and that no amount of rehearsal can produce from nothing. William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy had it. Not immediately, or not visibly, not in the way that later accounts would sometimes suggest, as though two men looked at each other on the first day of filming and understood everything that was going to happen. The chemistry between them developed the way real chemistry always does, through proximity, through repetition, through the particular intimacy of spending 8 hours a day pretending to be other people alongside the same person, month after month, year after year, through the shared experience of a show that the critics initially dismissed and the audience gradually, then suddenly, claimed as their own. The original Star Trek ran for 3 seasons, 79 episodes between 1966 and 1969. By the standards of the time, it was a modest run, cancelled before its natural conclusion, sent off the air without the ceremony it would eventually be understood to have deserved. But something happened in syndication, in the years after cancellation, that nobody at NBC had predicted and nobody at Paramount had planned for. The show found its audience, not the audience that had been available on Thursday nights at 8:30, but the audience that was there in reruns, in late-night slots, in the years when the original viewers grew older and began passing the show to people who had been too young to see it the first time. Star Trek became a phenomenon not by surviving, but by returning. And every time it returned, it brought Shatner and Nimoy with it. 6 feature films followed the original series. Star Trek, the motion picture, in 1979. The Wrath of Khan in 1982, still considered by many the finest film in the franchise, built around the kind of emotional weight that a television budget could never have supported. The Search for Spock, The Voyage Home, The Final Frontier, which Shatner directed himself, The Undiscovered Country. Across those 6 films, across the nearly quarter-century that separated the first episode from the final theatrical appearance of the original crew, Shatner and Nimoy remained the gravitational center of everything. Kirk and Spock, the captain and the science officer, the heart and the mind. And in the space between filming, in the space that the cameras did not capture, that the interviews only partially revealed, that the memoirs would later try to reconstruct from memory and feeling, there was the friendship. It was not, Shatner has been clear about this, an uncomplicated friendship. Nothing that lasts 50 years between 2 people in a competitive industry ever is. There was tension. There was professional jealousy. And here it is important to be precise about what that jealousy was and what it was not, because Shatner himself has been remarkably candid about it, and his candor deserves to be honored rather than exaggerated. When Spock became, in the course of the original series, more popular than Kirk, when Leonard Nimoy's stoic, precise, internally turbulent half-Vulcan began drawing the kind of fervent audience devotion that surprised everyone, including Nimoy himself, Shatner noticed. Of course he noticed. He was the lead of the show. He was playing the captain. And the science officer was, by some measures, outshining him. Shatner later admitted to The Hollywood Reporter, with the honesty of a man who has decided that self-examination is more useful than self-protection, that he had gone to the producers to raise the question, to ask what the popularity of Spock was going to mean for the direction of the show. He was careful, even in retrospect, to locate the anxiety in the right place. My anxieties, he admitted, were never directed at Leonard per se. It was about how the show was going to go. That is a precise and important distinction. The anxiety was professional, not personal. And what is remarkable, what says something genuine and specific about who Leonard Nimoy was, is that Nimoy did not use his popularity as leverage, did not pull away, did not allow the imbalance of the moment to damage what they were building together. He remained, through that period and for decades afterward, the most consistent defender Shatner had in an industry where critics and former colleagues were occasionally less generous, because not everyone loved William Shatner. James Doohan, who played Montgomery Scott, Scotty, had a relationship with Shatner that was openly difficult, documented in interviews and memoirs with a frankness that left little ambiguity. Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura, was not warmer. Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, had his reservations, and George Takei, who played Hikaru Sulu, and who has made his feelings about Shatner a matter of extraordinarily public record, was perhaps the most vocal of all, a decades-long public tension that has never been fully resolved and that Shatner has addressed with varying degrees of patience over the years. Against that backdrop, against the friction that Shatner generated with so many of the people who worked alongside him, Leonard Nimoy was something singular. Shatner called him, in the memoir that came after Nimoy's death, the only friend I ever had. That is not a line written for effect. Or if it is the kind of effect that can only be achieved by a man who means what he is saying. The only friend. In 50 years of one of the most famous careers in American entertainment. The only one. That is not a story about Star Trek. That is a story about loneliness wearing a captain's uniform and finding, against all the odds that the industry stacks against genuine connection, one person who stayed until he didn't. There is a particular cruelty to endings that do not announce themselves. The endings that arrive with ceremony, with a confrontation, a final argument, a door slammed with enough force to register as a conclusion. Those endings are painful, but they are at least legible. You know what happened. You know where the break is. You can point to the moment and say, there. That is where it ended. And the knowing, as terrible as it is, gives you something to hold, something to examine, something to eventually, if you are lucky and if you do the work, understand. But the ending that arrives as silence, that comes not as a door slamming, but as a door simply ceasing to open. That kind of ending offers nothing to hold. No confrontation to revisit. No final words to parse for meaning. Nothing but the growing, horrible awareness that the calls are not being returned, that the messages are not being answered, that the person on the other side has decided, for reasons they have not explained and may never explain, to simply stop. That is what happened between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. And it began, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, in 2012. Shatner was making a documentary. The project was called The Captains, a film in which Shatner would interview every actor who had ever played a lead captain in the Star Trek franchise. Patrick Stewart, Avery Brooks, Kate Mulgrew, Scott Bakula, Chris Pine. It was, in concept, a generous project, a celebration of the franchise and the people who had carried it, anchored by Shatner's particular combination of charm and self-awareness, and the kind of authority that comes from having been at the center of something for longer than most careers last. He wanted Nimoy in the film. Nimoy said no. The refusal was not accompanied, as far as the public record shows, by an extensive explanation. Nimoy was, by 2012, beginning a gradual withdrawal from public life. A withdrawal that his family and those close to him would later understand as connected, at least in part, to the illness that was quietly advancing inside him. The chronic obstructive pulmonary disease that would eventually take his life had begun making itself known. Nimoy had been a smoker for much of his adult life, a habit he had abandoned 30 years before his death, but a habit whose consequences, as is so often the case, did not honor the timeline of his decision to stop. The damage had been done. The disease was progressing, and Nimoy, with the particular privacy that some people choose when they are confronting something they cannot control, was beginning to draw inward. But the documentary refusal was not, on its own, the thing that broke the silence open. What happened next is the detail that Shatner has returned to, in multiple interviews and in his memoir, with the quality of a man trying to understand something that remains, even after years of examination, genuinely unclear to him. At a comic book convention, one of the large multi-day events that the Star Trek franchise has anchored for decades, where both Shatner and Nimoy were appearing as guests, the crew filming The Captains captured footage of Nimoy. Not as part of a planned interview, not with Nimoy's knowledge or consent. The cameras were there for Shatner, covering the convention as part of the documentary's broader sweep, and Nimoy moved through the frame, or near the frame, or in a space adjacent to where the cameras were pointed. And the footage was taken. Nimoy found out. And Nimoy was upset. Exactly how upset, and exactly what form that upset took, and exactly what was communicated between the two men in the aftermath. These details live in the private space that neither man fully opened to public examination. What is known is that Nimoy felt that his image had been captured without his authorization. What is known is that this incident, this moment at a convention involving cameras and consent and a boundary that Nimoy felt had been crossed, became, in the months and years that followed, the apparent beginning of a silence that would last until Nimoy's death. Shatner has said, plainly and repeatedly, that he does not know why Nimoy stopped talking to him. That sentence deserves to be read slowly, because it contains something genuinely extraordinary inside its simplicity. William Shatner, a man who has spent 95 years paying close and often brilliant attention to the world around him, a man who has written memoirs and given thousands of interviews and examined his own life with more public candor than most people bring to their private journals, does not know why his closest friend of 50 years stopped speaking to him. He has offered a theory. In Boldly Go, the memoir published in 2022, Shatner reflected on the possibility that Nimoy's illness, the advancing pulmonary disease, the gathering awareness of mortality, the way that serious illness can reorganize a person's relationship to everything and everyone around them, may have played a role. That Nimoy, as he moved deeper into the experience of being sick in a way he could not recover from, may have found it impossible, emotionally, psychically, in whatever private calculus governs how a dying man decides where to spend his remaining energy, to reach back toward the friendship and do the work of reconciliation that unspoken grievances require. It is a compassionate theory. It is the theory of a man who loved his friend and wants to understand rather than condemn. And it may be true. It may be part of the truth. It may be the most accurate explanation available, given that the only person who knew the full answer took that answer with him when he died. But Shatner does not claim it as certainty. He claims it as grief. There is a distinction there between explanation and grief that matters enormously. An explanation closes something. It gives you a frame, a reason, a place to file the loss so that you can move past it. Grief keeps everything open. Grief says, I do not know. I may never know. And I am carrying this anyway. For 5 years, from approximately 2012 to February of 2015, William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy did not speak. Two men who had known each other for over half a century, two men whose friendship had survived professional jealousy and franchise fatigue and the particular pressures that fame applies to every relationship it touches. Two men who had, by Shatner's own account, been as close as any two people in the entertainment industry could be. 5 years of silence. And then, on a morning in late February, in a house in Los Angeles, Leonard Nimoy died. What happens to a man who has been waiting across 5 years of silence for the door to open again, and instead learns that the door has been sealed permanently from the other side, without warning, without resolution, without the conversation that he had been hoping might still come? Leonard Nimoy died on the morning of February 27, 2015. He was 83 years old. He was at home in Los Angeles. He had family with him. His son Adam made the announcement to the world, a brief, careful statement that confirmed what the pulmonary disease had been telling everyone who was paying close attention for the better part of 3 years. The end had been coming, and then it came. The world responded the way the world responds to the death of someone who has become genuinely embedded in its imagination. Tributes arrived from every corner of the entertainment industry and beyond it. Presidents and scientists and artists and ordinary people who had simply grown up with Spock on their television screens. All of them paused to mark the moment, to say something about what Nimoy had meant to them, to acknowledge that something irreplaceable had left the room. The Vulcan salute, that simple, elegant, two-fingered gesture that Nimoy himself had invented for the character, drawing from a Jewish priestly blessing he had witnessed as a child in Boston, appeared everywhere, on social media, on the steps of government buildings, in photographs sent in from every country where Star Trek had ever been broadcast. The world said goodbye in the only way the world knows how to say goodbye to its icons. Loudly, collectively, with the kind of public grief that is genuine and performative at the same time, because that is the only register available when the loss belongs to everyone at once. William Shatner was not at the funeral. This is a fact. It is documented. It is something Shatner has addressed directly, in interviews and in writing, with the kind of honesty that costs something to offer. He had a prior commitment, a charity obligation, a scheduled appearance that he had agreed to before Nimoy's death, before the timeline of the illness made the question of a funeral suddenly urgent and real. And Shatner made the decision, in the hours and days between the death and the burial, not to cancel that commitment. He went to the charity event. He did not go to the funeral. What do we do with that? The prompt before you was built on a commitment to present this without moral judgment. And that commitment is worth honoring, because the impulse to judge is almost automatic here, and almost certainly too simple for what the situation actually was. Shatner has said that not attending the funeral was another point of pain. Not just a logistical decision, but a decision that carried its own weight of regret, its own complicated layer in the larger archaeology of loss that the whole relationship had become. But it is also worth sitting with the full texture of the situation, because the texture matters. This was not a friendship in its normal state when Nimoy died. This was a friendship that had been suspended, frozen, silent, for 5 years. Shatner had been waiting, across those 5 years, for something to change. For a phone call, for a message, for some signal from Nimoy that the door was open again. None had come. And then Nimoy was gone, and the waiting was over, and the door was not open. It was simply no longer there. To attend the funeral of a man who had not spoken to you for 5 years is to make a statement. To not attend is also to make a statement. Either way, in the absence of the conversation that never happened, every action carries a weight it might not have carried in a friendship that had remained intact. Shatner was navigating a loss that was not only the loss of his friend to death, it was the loss of the 5 years before the death, and the loss of the conversation that might have explained the silence, and the loss of the reconciliation that he had presumably, quietly, hoped was still possible. He was grieving something that had already been grieving before Nimoy died, and then, after the death, after the funeral he did not attend, after the world had processed its collective loss and moved on to the next thing, something happened that Shatner has described as one of the most significant moments of the entire painful chapter. Julie Nimoy, Leonard's daughter, reached out to him. She contacted Shatner to tell him something that, given the 5 years of silence, given the unanswered calls and the undelivered explanations, given everything that had accumulated between two men who had once been each other's closest companion, was either the most comforting thing she could have said or the most devastating, or both at once. which is the way the most important messages tend to arrive. She told him that her father had loved him, that Leonard Nimoy, in whatever private space he had occupied during those 5 years of silence, in whatever internal landscape a dying man inhabits when he has withdrawn from the people who mattered most to him, had loved William Shatner, had carried that love alongside whatever grievance or pain or incapacity had kept him from picking up the phone. Shatner received that message. He has written about it, he has spoken about it, and he has done so with the restraint of a man who understands that some information arrives too late to be fully useful. Not because it is not true, not because it does not matter, but because the person it most concerns, the person whose voice delivering it might have changed something, is no longer available to speak. It is the right information. It is also the information that arrived after the window in which it could have been spoken directly had permanently closed. There is one more piece of this that needs to be named before we can speak about legacy. In the days before his death, in the final weeks of February 2015, as the disease was taking the last of what it had been steadily claiming for years, Leonard Nimoy sent a final message to the world, not through a press release, not through a statement from his publicist. He sent it the way that people in the 21st century send their most personal communications, through a social media post. His final public message, the last thing he chose to say to the world before he died, was this: "A life is like a garden. Perfect moments can be had, but not preserved, except in memory. Live long and prosper." He signed it with the abbreviation of the phrase he had made famous, the 4 letters that had followed him across 50 years of the most recognizable character he had ever played. He did not send a final message to William Shatner. Or if he did, it has never been made public. And Shatner, 95 years old, still writing, still reflecting, still carrying the weight of a question that has no answer, has never said that one arrived. There are friendships that end, and there are friendships that simply stop. The ones that end have a shape to them, a beginning, a middle, a recognizable conclusion that, however painful, gives the participants something to carry forward. The story has an ending, and endings, even the hardest ones, are something the human mind knows how to hold. We are built for narrative. We are built for resolution. We understand loss when it has a final scene. The ones that simply stop are different. They stop without a scene, without a final conversation, without the moment of reckoning that would allow both people to say what they needed to say, and then, whatever the outcome, reconciliation or rupture, at least know that it had been said. The friendship that stops is the one you are still, in some private part of yourself, waiting to resume, right up until the moment you learn that resuming it is no longer possible. And then the waiting transforms into something else, something heavier, something that does not have a clean name in any language, because it is not quite grief, and not quite regret, and not quite guilt. It is all of those things at once, compacted together into a weight that a person carries not for a season, but for the rest of their life. William Shatner is 95 years old. He is still carrying it. In the decade since Leonard Nimoy's death in February of 2015, Shatner has returned to this story with a consistency that is not the consistency of a man seeking attention or sympathy, but the consistency of a man who genuinely cannot put it down. He wrote the memoir Leonard in 2016, 1 year after the death, while the loss was still raw enough to leave marks on every page. He returned to it again in Boldly Go in 2022, 7 years later, and found that the weight had not diminished in the way that time is supposed to diminish these things. He has given interviews in which the subject arises, and his answers carry the quality of a man who has rehearsed the question 10,000 times and still has not found the response that fully satisfies him. Because the response that would fully satisfy him would require an answer from someone who is no longer available to give it. He wrote, in Leonard, words that do not require embellishment or interpretation to land with their full force. He wrote that one of his greatest regrets is that he and Leonard were not as close as they had been during those last few years of Nimoy's life. He wrote that it is heartbreaking. He wrote that it is something he will wonder about and regret forever. Forever is a word that a 95-year-old man uses carefully. It is not hyperbole when Shatner uses it. It is a precise statement of fact. He will carry this for however long he has remaining. He will wonder about it. He will turn it over in the way that the mind turns over the things it cannot resolve. Not obsessively, not destructively, but with the steady, patient, ultimately fruitless attention that unsolvable questions attract. The question of why Leonard Nimoy stopped speaking to him will accompany William Shatner to the end of his life, and it will not be answered before it gets there. And yet, there is something in what Julie Nimoy told him that deserves to be heard in full. Not as consolation, exactly, because consolation implies a comfort that closes something, and this does not close anything, but as the most important piece of information available in the absence of the conversation that never happened. Leonard Nimoy loved him. Whatever the silence was, whatever its cause, whether it was the filming incident at the convention or the advancing illness reorganizing Nimoy's emotional world, or some combination of the two, or something else entirely that neither man ever named publicly, the silence was not the absence of love. It was something that happened alongside the love, parallel to it, without replacing it. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that the surviving evidence makes clear with any certainty. The grief on Shatner's side is legible and documented and ongoing. The love on Nimoy's side was communicated, imperfectly, posthumously, through a daughter carrying a message across a silence that had lasted 5 years, but communicated nonetheless. Two men, born 3 days apart in 1931. They met in Hollywood in the years before anyone knew their names. They built, across 50 years and 3 television seasons and 6 feature films and an uncountable number of conventions and public appearances and private moments that the cameras never reached, something that Shatner called the only real friendship of his life. And in the final chapter of that friendship, in the years when one of them was quietly dying and the other was quietly waiting, they did not speak. And the one who died sent his last words not to the friend who had been there for 50 years, but to the world. A life is like a garden. Perfect moments can be had, but not preserved, except in memory. Shatner has had a long time to sit with that sentence. He has had a long time to consider what it means, what it asks of him, what it offers, what it withholds. A garden. Perfect moments that cannot be preserved except in memory. The Spock half of Nimoy would have found something logical in that formulation, an acceptance of impermanence that the Vulcan discipline had always prized above the human tendency to cling. The human half of Nimoy, the half that grew up in Boston, that decided at 11 years old that the stage was the only place he belonged, that built a friendship across half a century, and then, in the final years, went quiet in a way that no one has ever fully explained. That half is harder to read in the sentence, but it is there. The acknowledgement that perfect moments exist, that they are worth having. That memory is the only form of preservation available to us, William Shatner remembers. At 95 years old, having traveled to the edge of space and written the books and received the message from the daughter and carried the question through a decade without an answer, he remembers. He remembers the 50 years. He remembers the friendship. He remembers the only friend he ever had, by his own account, in a life that by any external measure appears to have been full and rich and enormously well-lived. He remembers. And he still does not know why the silence came. And that, the not knowing, the carrying of a question that will never be answered, the love that continued on both sides of a silence that neither man was able to break before time ran out. That is the real story of Kirk and Spock, not the bridge of the Enterprise, not the pointed ears and the arched eyebrow and the phrase that became a benediction, not the 6 films and the conventions and the cultural legacy that will outlast everyone who built it. The real story is 2 men from the same year, from the same tradition, from the same hunger that brought them both to Hollywood before anyone was watching, who found each other and held on for 50 years, and then lost each other in the silence at the end. If this story moved you, if you have ever carried a question someone took with them before you could ask it, leave a tribute in the comments for Leonard Nimoy and for William Shatner, who is still here, still remembering, still wondering. What does it tell us about the friendships we have right now, the ones we are in the middle of, the ones we have been meaning to call? That even 50 years is not enough time to say everything that needs to be said? Subscribe to Golden Fame News, where every week we honor the lives behind the legends. The full story, not just the highlight reel. And remember, a life is like a garden. Tend to it while you can.